Okay, I'm going to go ahead and open the webinar. Narad. And I really want to welcome all of you that are here, and as you're signing in to our new perspective series that we've been running now for a couple weeks. The series is on Savitri, a legend and a symbol, and it's dedicated to Sri Aurobindo's 150th birth anniversary. Vladimir and I are here at the LaGrasse Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center in Fountain Inn, South Carolina. And joining us today is our illustrious speaker and chairman of the Sri Aurobindo Integral Life Center, whom you all know very well, Narad. Narad, welcome. We're thrilled and honored to be hosting you today on this very important series on Savitri.
Thank you.
Narad today will address Savitri as a future of poetry and novelty in world literature. He reminds us that Savitri is the mantra for the transformation of the world. It has come down from the heights of the overmind and far above. He says it is Sri Aurobindo's greatest gift to humanity, and by reading it regularly, we can ascend faster and higher to the realization of the self and union with the divine. As many of you know, Savitri is the tale of divine love, conquering falsehood and bringing down to the earth a life divine. Before turning it over to Narad, I just wanted to remind everyone that's joining us today that each Sunday, the LaGrasse Center hosts Narad for Savitri Sunday over Zoom. And during this half-hour period from 9 a.m. New York time, 7:30 p.m. Indian time, Narad reads passages from Savitri and discusses and explores with the group the meaning of the readings. So I'll be putting in the chat box the Zoom link for those that would like to join tomorrow. There's no registration that's required. You just click on the link at 9 o'clock. And I'll also be putting in there just a link to our website that explains a little bit more what Savitri Sunday is about. As always, please put any of the questions that you might have in the Q&A box, and or just raise your hand during the series here, and we'll bring you over as a panelist to join us towards the end for any comments or sharing or questions that you might have for Narad. So again, welcome, and at this point, Narad, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Thank you. A few words about myself. I have been reading Savitri for more than 60 years, and it has become my path in the practice of the integral yoga. Yet, how much have I learned of this entirely new poetry that is mantric in its very essence? Although I teach classes in Savitri, if I'm able to convey a little, share my understanding of a little, it is not because I have stood on the shoulders of great sages, but because they, in their infinite love, have leaned down to me and helped me to go deeper into Savitri. Their names are legendary in the integral yoga of Sri Aurobindo and the Mother. Nolini Kantragupta, Amal Kiran, Arvind Basu, Temi Masalawal, Jumur, Madhav Pandit, Shraddhalu Ranade, Alok Pandey, Ranga, and Vladimir Yatsenko. Here are a few of Mother's words on Savitri. Radhe has already quoted one. Savitri is a mantra for the transformation of the world. Mother spoke this to Udar. Savitri, this prophetic vision of the world's history, including the announcement of the Earth's future. The importance of Savitri is immense. Its subject is universal. Its revelation is prophetic. The time spent in its atmosphere is not wasted. The The more you read, the more marvelous it becomes. The direct intervention of the Supreme's will in opposition to the whole set of laws governing the manifestation. Mother writes further, Sri Aurobindo has expressed this at least 3 times in Savitri. She said in a diary containing quotations from Savitri, some extracts from Savitri, that marvelous prophetic poem, which will be humanity's guide towards its future realization. Again, a complete system of yoga, which can serve as a guide for those who want to follow the integral sadhana. And lastly, the yoga of the earth in its ascension towards the divine. Savitri is certainly unique in all the world's literature. It is an epic of nearly 24,000 lines, written in iambic pentameter, the meter that the greatest epic poets have used. Sri Aurobindo, a master of masters in the English language, studied all the major poets and read their works extensively. He read Virgil and Homer in the original, and in later years even wrote to his disciples of the plains from which their inspiration came. Earlier, he did not attribute lines to the overhead influence, but as he grew into higher and higher states of consciousness, he was even able to attribute the overhead influence to some of the greatest lines of poetry. His intensive work on Savitri was so profound that he rewrote Book 1, Canto 1, 50 times as he ascended higher and higher. He helped many of the budding poets of the ashram to pen lines of great force and beauty. But when he left his body, poetry, for the most part, ceased among his disciples. I'm going to read to you something of the essence of poetry from Sri Aurobindo. What then is the nature of poetry, its essential law? What is the highest power we can demand from it? What the supreme music that the human mind, reaching up and in and out to its own widest spreads, deepest depths, and topmost summits, can extract from this self-expressive instrument? And how out of that does there arise the possibility of its use as a mantra of the real? Not that we need spend any energy in a vain effort to define anything so profound, elusive, and indefinable as the breath of poetic creation. To take the myriad stringed harp of Saraswati to pieces for the purpose of scientific analysis is a narrow and barren amusement. But we stand in need of some guiding intuitions, some helpful descriptions, which will serve to enlighten our search, to fix in that way, not by definition, but by description, the essential things in poetry is neither an impossible nor an unprofitable endeavor. For neither the intelligence, the imagination, nor the ear are the true, or at least the deepest or highest recipients of the poetic delight, even as they are not its true or highest creators. They are only its channels and instruments. The true creator, the true hearer, is the soul. The more rapidly and transparently the rest do their work of transmission, the less they make of their separate claim to satisfaction. The more directly the word reaches and sinks deep into the soul, the greater the poetry. Therefore, poetry has not really done its work, at least its highest work, until it has raised the pleasure of the instrument and transmuted it into the deeper delight of the soul. A divine ananda, a delight interpretive, creative, revealing, formative, one might almost say an inverse reflection of the joy which the universal soul felt in its great release of energy when it rang out into the rhythmic forms of the universe, the spiritual truth, the large interpretive idea, the life, the power, the emotion of things packed into an original creative vision. Such spiritual joy is that which the soul of the poet feels, and which, when he can conquer the human difficulties of his task, he succeeds in pouring also into all those who are prepared to receive it. This delight is not merely a godlike pastime. It is a great formative and illuminative power. Ananda, in the language of Indian spiritual experience, is the essential delight which the infinite feels in itself and in its creation. By the infinite self's ananda, all exists. For the self's ananda, all was made. Sri Aurobindo wrote a wealth of letters to his disciples on his decades of writing Savitri. Here is a part of a letter he wrote to a disciple. First, he defines the characters, something I would advise all to read. It is found at the beginning in a separate paragraph entitled Author's Note. In the last sentence, he writes, "Still this, Savitri, is not a mere allegory. The characters are not personified qualities, but incarnations or emanations of living and conscious forces with whom we can enter into concrete touch. And they take human bodies in order to help man and show him the way from his mortal state to a divine consciousness and immortal life." Although certain budding poets like Amal Kiran often suggested lines that he thought were more appropriate, Sri Aurobindo would answer him clearly and decisively. The mother did not appreciate these efforts and said so. Still, for some of us, Sri Aurobindo's explanations of his ascent to a higher and higher consciousness gave us so many illustrations of the planes above the physical mind, the higher mind, the illumined mind, the intuitive mind, and even the overmind and the overhead influence in poetry. And as a result, we have received a great treasure in his article on overhead poetry. I quote again from Sri Aurobindo. "The mantra, as I have tried to describe it in the future poetry, is a word of power and light that comes from the overmind inspiration or from some very high plane of intuition. Its characteristics are a language that conveys infinitely more than the mere surface sense of the words seems to indicate. A rhythm that means even more than the language and is born out of the infinite and disappears into it, and the power to convey not merely the mental, vital, or physical contents or indications or values of the thing uttered, but its significance and figure in some fundamental and original consciousness, which is behind all these and greater. The passages you mentioned from the Upanishad and the Gita have certainly the overmind accent. But ordinarily, the overmind inspiration does not come out pure in human poetry. It has to come down to an inferior consciousness and touch it, or else to lift it by a seizure and surprise from above into some infinite largeness. There is always a mixture of the two elements, not an absolute transformation, though the higher may sometimes dominate. You must remember that the overmind is a superhuman consciousness, and to be able to write always or purely from an overmind inspiration would mean the elevation of, or at least a part of the nature, beyond the human level. He then writes of the overmind and aesthetics, which gives us a very deep insight. Obviously, the overmind and aesthetics cannot be equated together. Aesthetics is concerned mainly with beauty, but more generally with rasa, the response of the mind, the vital feeling, and the sense to a certain taste in things, which often may be, but is not necessarily a spiritual feeling. Aesthetics belongs to the mental range and all that depends upon it. It may degenerate into aestheticism, or may exaggerate or narrow itself into some version of the theory of art for art's sake. The overmind is essentially a spiritual power. Mind in it surpasses its ordinary self and rises and takes its stand on a spiritual foundation. It embraces beauty and sublimates it. It has an essential aesthesis, which is not limited by rules and canons. It sees a universal and an eternal beauty, while it takes up and transforms all that is limited and particular. It is, besides, concerned with things other than beauty or aesthetics. It is concerned especially with truth and knowledge, or rather with a wisdom that exceeds what we call knowledge. Its truth goes beyond truth of fact and truth of thought. Even the higher thought, which is the first spiritual range of the thinker. It has the truth of spiritual thought, spiritual feeling, spiritual sense, and at its highest, the truth that comes by the most intimate spiritual touch, or by identity. We continue further down in his article. In all poetry, a poetical aesthesis of some kind there must be in the writer and the recipient. But aesthesis is of so many kinds, and the ordinary kind is not sufficient for appreciating the overhead element in poetry. A fundamental and universal aesthesis is needed, something also more intense that listens, sees, and feels from deep within and answers to what is far behind the surface. A greater, wider, and deeper aesthesis than which can answer even to the transcendent and feel too whatever of the transcendent or spiritual enters into the things of life, mind, and sense. Something more might need to be said in regard to the overhead note in poetry and the overmind aesthesis. But these are exactly the subjects on which it is difficult to write with any precision or satisfy the intellect's demand for clear and positive statement. Sri Aurobindo gives us some examples of lines descended from the overmind consciousness, and they have always been for me inspirational and deeply informative. He writes, if I had to select a line in European poetry which most suggests an almost direct descent from the overmind consciousness, there might come first Virgil's line about the touch of tears in mortal things. Sunt lacrimae rerum et mentem mortalia tangent. Another might be Shakespeare's. In the dark, backward, and abysm of time. Or again, Milton's, those thoughts that wander through eternity. We might also add Wordsworth's line, the winds come to me from the fields of sleep. There are others less ideative and more emotional, or simply descriptive, which might be added, such as Marlowe's, was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? If we could extract and describe the quality and subtle something that mark the language and rhythm and feeling of these lines and underlie their substance, we might attain hazardously to some mental understanding of the nature of overhead poetry. If you note the combination of words and sounds in Shakespeare's line, and in this harsh world, draw thy breath in pain, so arranged as to force on the mind, and still more on the subtle nerves and sense, the absoluteness of the difficulty and pain of living for the soul that has awakened to the misery of the world. You can see how this technique works. Here and elsewhere, the very body and soul of the thing, seen or felt, come out into the open. The same dominant characteristic can be found in other lines, which I have not cited. In Leopardi's, insano indegno mistero delle cose, the insane and ignoble mystery of things. Or in Wordsworth's, voyaging through strange seas of thought alone. Milton's line lives by its choice of the word wander to collocate with through eternity. If he had chosen any other word, it would no longer have been an overhead line, even if the surface sense had been exactly the same. On the other hand, take Shelley's stanza. We look before and after, and pine for what is not. Our sincerest laughter with some pain is fraught. Our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. Sri Aurobindo writes, this is perfect poetry with the most exquisite melody and beauty of wording and an unsurpassable poignancy of pathos, but there is no touch or note of the overhead inspiration. It is the mind and the heart, the vital emotion, working at their highest pitch under the stress of a psychic inspiration. The rhythm is of the same character, a direct, straightforward, lucid, and lucent movement, welling out limpidly straight from the psychic source. The same characteristics are found in another short lyric of Shelley's, which is perhaps the purest example of the psychic inspiration in English poetry. I can give not what men call love, but wilt thou accept not the worship the heart lifts above, and the heavens reject not? The desire of the moth for the star, of the night for the morrow, the devotion to something afar from the sphere of our sorrow. We have again extreme poetic beauty there, but nothing of the overhead note Sri Aurobindo mentions. The second level on which poetry draws into itself a fuller language of intuitive inspiration, illumination for the higher thinking and feeling. A very rich or great poetry may then emerge, and many of the most powerful passages in Shakespeare, Virgil, or Lucretius, or the Mahabharata and Ramayana, not to speak of the Gita, the Upanishads, or the Rig Veda, have this inspiration. It is a poetry thick inlaid with patines of bright gold, or welling up in a stream of passion, beauty, and force. But sometimes there comes down a supreme voice, the overmind voice, and the overmind music. And it is to be observed that the lines and passages where that happens rank among the greatest and most admired in all poetic literature. It would be, therefore, too much to say that the overhead inspiration cannot bring in a greatness into poetry which could surpass the other levels of inspiration, greater even than the purely aesthetic point of view, and certainly greater in the power of its substance. Sri Aurobindo has also left with us many new experiments in rhythmic meters and poetry of all poetic ranges, from his youth to his last days, when Narad speaks. I end my talk with the following lines. The last Sri Aurobindo dedicated as Narad speaks to the Queen. The very last lines, some may be quoted. As a star, uncompanioned, moves in heaven, unastonished by the immensities of space, traveling infinity by its own light, the great are strongest when they stand alone. A God-given might of being is their force, a ray from self's solitude of light, the guide. The soul that can live alone with itself meets God. Its lonely universe is their rendezvous. A day may come when she must stand unhelped on a dangerous brink of the world's doom and hers, carrying the world's future on her lonely breast, carrying the human hope in a heart left sole to conquer or fail on a last desperate verge, alone with death and close to extinction's edge. Her single greatness in that last dire scene must cross alone a perilous bridge in time and reach an apex of world destiny where all is won or all is lost for man. In that tremendous silence, lone and lost, of a deciding hour in the world's fate, in her soul's climbing beyond mortal time, when she stands soul with death or soul with God, apart upon a silent, desperate brink, alone with herself and death and destiny, as on some verge between time and timelessness, when being must end or life rebuild its base. Alone she must conquer, or alone must fall. No armored God stand shining at her side. Cry not to heaven, for she alone can save. For this the silent force came missioned down. In her the conscious will took human shape. She only can save herself and save the world. O Queen, stand back from that stupendous scene. Come not between her and her hour of fate. Her hour must come, and none can intervene. Think not to turn her from her heaven-sent task. Strive not to save her from her own high will. Thou hast no place in that tremendous strife. Thy love and longing are not arbiters there. Leave the world's fate and her to God's sole guard. Even if he seems to leave her to her lone strength, even though all falters and falls and sees an end and the heart fails and only are death and night, God-given, her strength can battle against doom, even on a brink where death alone seems close, and no human strength can hinder or can help. Think not to intercede with the hidden will. Intrude not twixt her spirit and its force, but leave her to her mighty self and fate. Book 6, the Book of Fate. Namaste. If there are some questions, I know I'm only used up 33 minutes, but
thank you, Narad. Thank you, Narad, very much. Yeah, it's very moving to hear how the poetry is working upon our consciousness. Can you hear me? Not very well? Lightly. Most
Yeah, we can hear you. It's just as you're moving it, it's making all sorts of noise.
Okay, so if there are some questions to this presentation on poetry, how poetry is working upon our consciousness and why this poetic word is the most powerful, actually all the points are already highlighted by Narad. It's not just the poetry combination of words in a nice fashion. It is a consciousness behind which is being expressed, and Sri Aurobindo is teaching us how to distinguish that. He gives us examples which could really help us to feel and to understand what he means. This kind of education we can't find anywhere. Nobody goes that deep and that high and that far as Sri Aurobindo did. And as he himself says that he made Savitri the means for his progress in yoga. bringing higher and higher realms of consciousness into expression in the word. So with this, I would like to actually see the questions. There is one question here, or no question, as it's called. No question, but the empowering feeling. I feel
You're
so...
still having a little problem with the sound. Maybe hold it away just a little bit. It's crackling as you
Okay,
speak.
and now is better?
Better.
Okay. So Shrimai Shukla says, no question, but the empowering feeling. I feel sorry and scared for her, for the mother, for Savitri. How did she go along alone to conquer and alone to fall while focusing on God and not being alone? It's just a remark from that it touches us deeply. And that passage, what you read from Narad read passage from Narad, which is about the mother. And there is one more question. How can we attempt to connect with the overhead in what we do?
That's a good question. Poetry comes to me almost automatically. When I say automatically, I mean I attribute it all to Sri Aurobindo. He sends it down, and I can only take credit for the mistakes, but not for the poems themselves. They are his largesse in my life and his compassionate love that comes in silent moments, in times of stress, in times of great peacefulness, morning, noon, night, sometimes the middle of the night, they come. And how can we open to that except to love Sri Aurobindo and Mother more and more deeply, to aspire at least to offer, enjoy ourselves to their yoga. Because never before on this earth has there been the possibility of a divine life, the possibility of the conquest of death. All the other yogas, as great as they have been, have very often felt that they found enough when they received moksha, liberation, and did not go further. They melded into the divine consciousness. That was sufficient for them. But Sri Aurobindo says, no, we must go deeper. We must bring this light to the earth, that there can be a life divine on earth and the supramental race of men in its time. Now we see so much conflict in the world, so many challenges, so much darkness, so much evil. But we must have one faith only, and that is that a drop of light can obliterate all darkness.
Thank you. There is from Nandini. She says it was a great reading. Thank you. And need more light on psychic inspiration. Overhead inspiration, as mentioned, is not of that level in Shelley's poem, for example, as you mentioned already.
Yeah, the overhead is not there. The psychic is there. It's the greatest the greatest poem of the psychic presence in all languages. But it doesn't have we have to remember, you see, that Sri Aurobindo almost always wrote in the epic style. And his main concentrations were on Homer, Virgil, Milton, and others, and of course the Indian writers. So he is speaking mainly from the overhead influence in epic poetry, which has that vastness, that wideness, that consummate voice of truth and power and love.
And by the way, what in the examples what you gave, one can feel that difference of the psychic aspiration and the overhead inspiration. And they are tangible. When Sri Aurobindo points to them, we could feel them and experience even them in the words. We could kind of trace them through the words to those regions, could feel them present there. Thank you. Reading was excellent. It was really reaching deeply to the heart. There is also a question from Gloria. In your understanding, what the Queen represents or manifests?
We know that, of course, she is Ashwapati's wife, a very, very brilliant lady, extremely brilliant. But when she hears this proclamation of Narad that the young man Savitri has chosen will die in 1 year, she voices all the human angst, all the human grief, because what would her child have after Satyavan's departure? In those days, she could become a nun or commit sati, and that was about it. So her mother, in the Book of Fate, 2 cantos, posits all the voices that we have heard through decades. The idea of God being inadequate to the world he supposedly made because he cannot conquer death. He cannot conquer evil. But this is not something that the human mind can easily understand. If we can go above body, life, and mind into those higher realms, beginning with the higher mind, we will have a totally different vision of the world, a totally different understanding of this divine game that he is playing, when from the heights he minimizes himself and descends into this darkness of the world. And we cannot see it as a game from our level of consciousness. We must rise into that next level, which I've mentioned before, beginning with the higher mind, illumined mind, intuitive mind, overmind, and above.
Thank you. There is a question from Abhinav. Can you please show some examples where mental level poetry was replaced by overhead?
I don't have any examples of that. Savitri is all poetry of the mantra and the highest of all poetry ever written. You know, Sri Aurobindo wrote almost 24,000 lines, and it is the longest poem written in the English language. So I would suggest don't even wonder about those things. Just go deeply into Savitri. Mother says Sri Aurobindo should not be studied by reading books, but by subjects. And if you can begin by reading Savitri, even a page a day, it will open you to new worlds and new and greater consciousness.
Of course, we can take overhead poetry and replace the words with some synonyms and get the mental formation. We can spoil the overhead poetry.
Yes, but
That
who
we
would want
can.
to do that?
Yeah, nobody wants to do that, right? I have a question from my side, especially on Sri Aurobindo's usage of the words and syntax. For example, I noticed that he's using sometimes not very common syntax in the English language, such as, for example, as in body and body lit the supreme fire or some. So this in body and body, for example, repetition, it is coming from the Vedic rishis usage. Yes? They loved this type. And many times I see that his inspirations are coming from the Vedic vision of Rigvedic rishis, you know. And imagery, about imagery I don't even say, it is all kind of inspired by the Vedic imagery. The fire, the word, and the sun, the wind. Most probably it's archetypal for all poetry, but still. About syntax, about his usage of the words and the position in the sentence, the repetition of certain kind of not possible to find or prohibited in English language. Could you say a few words about this?
Well, I think that one of the most important things, of course, is alliteration.
Mm.
And another one is paradoxes.
Mm.
Sri Aurobindo uses paradoxes so many times, you know. And how can you have an evil good?
Mm. Mm.
Statements like that. And his use of adjectives to amplify nouns is very, very beautiful.
Mm.
So, you know, we can look at Savitri in so many different ways. We can look at it from the constructive side of poetry, how one uses anapaests and how one moves the I ams. We can look at it from the spiritual point of view of what is he teaching us through Savitri. We can look at it even from the mental point of view. How does it compare with other poetry? There's so many ways that we can look at Savitri. For me, and Mother amplifies this also, she says, don't try to understand it with the mind. Read it again and again, and one day it will enter you and you will know what he is saying. I think that's the best way for me of all to.
Thank you. This is really beautiful. Mother said also that Savitri is the mantra of the transformation of the world. So, and this is her phrase, literally, transformation of the world. So it acts upon our consciousness and changes it. So, yes. Thank you, Narad, says someone, anonymous attendee. Would you like to say something on concentration above the head with respect to integral yoga? Because many people felt, and I felt very strongly, tangibly, presence over the head with overhead poetry.
Yes. For me, there is no question that in the Gita, Krishna tells us that many, many other things are needed. Karma yoga is needed, which was not accepted by many, many of the other doctrines of earlier times. Karma yoga is needed. But even the opening of the heart usually comes after the opening of the head. Sri Aurobindo says there's a descent into the head of this consciousness, and yes, the opening of the heart is just as important, but usually in poetry, I think it's Sri Aurobindo says that who is the poet? English poet. He says, poetry must be felt in the solar plexus. And that's an interesting statement.
Mm.
It must be felt there first, and then you get the essence of it. So
Thank
Sri
you.
Aurobindo first had his experiences in the head,
Mhm.
and through the head. And the psychic didn't open for quite some time while he was having all of these experiences above the head.
Mm.
We have to aspire for it. It's silencing the mind is critical. It's absolutely essential. He says it's the essence and the beginning of the yoga itself. Their quiet mind. Interestingly, Mother has named some flowers quiet mind, perfectly quiet mind, quietness established in the mind.
Mm.
And if we can, and they're oleanders, so the oleanders are very common plants. If we can hold a flower that has that vibration, that message in its vibration, and we can hold it to our head or to our hearts, certainly we can receive it.
Mm. I noticed that all Sri Aurobindo's writings, major writings like Light Divine, Synthesis, Essays on the Gita, even Human Cycle, and not to say about Savitri, when you start reading them, you feel immediately some pressure from above. It's as if a signature of Sri Aurobindo's words or his state of consciousness. It's very tangible in his words. Do you think that that combination of the words creates this, or maybe if somebody else with kind of ordinary consciousness would write the same poetry with the same words, it would be not felt, that overhead consciousness?
Because it has to be the mantra.
Right.
It has to be mantric. And as you say, and Purani, of course, who gave me my first copy of Savitri, said that the Vedas were key to much of Savitri.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So we have you for that now.
Right. Well, the Vedic language is so different in every way. They don't even care about satisfying some, mental symmetry or answer some questions or give some imagery, as if they are driven by another force, and it happens. And at the end, it has this impact on consciousness, which is miraculous in a way, which generates the visions or the understanding, rather, comprehension of who we are and what this world about. There are many things going beyond the words. They are in the presupposition. I will always say that we should read not what Sri Aurobindo says, but what he wants to say, but what he by what he says. So there is the whole presupposition to what he is expressing through the words, and that is much vaster in a way. The whole field is beyond that. And if we tune ourselves to this, we could feel that knowledge or that comprehension. There is anonymous attendee saying, "Thank you so much, Narad. And can you please talk a bit about reading Savitri aloud?"
Whoa, that could take an entire talk. But I'll get this. Savitri must be read aloud, first of all. Because if you don't read it aloud, the mantra will not come out. So Savitri must be read aloud. Now, when there are lines that may hint at some inflection, one has to feel those lines. Most people, when they begin reading Savitri, are just reading words. And they're beautiful words, there's no doubt about that. But they are not catching the mantric essence in the lines. And for me, I think that's the most important part of my reading of Savitri. But before I begin, I always ask him to read through this body. That it should not be a Narad reading it, but it should be the Lord reading through this voice and this form.
Thank you. There is one more question, or small question, and we will stop here. Sorry to. Hello, thank you for this beautiful lecture. I am French and would like to know, please, if I can read Savitri in French, or would I lose some things which are not?
This very question was asked to me the other day, and I answered, read it in French. read it in any language, because you will get something of it. And maybe even in time, you'll read it in English, but begin by reading it in your own tongue. It will work in you. It will elevate your consciousness. It will bring a beauty, a serenity, and an inner joy into your life. Read it always.
Thank you, Narad. Thank you so much. Namaste.
Thank you, Narad.